Snow whispered against the cabin walls through the night, and by dawn the world lay buried in white silence. Megan pulled the door open, breath clouding in the icy air, and froze. They were back, a perfect trail of pawprints, pressed clean into the untouched snow, leading straight to her porch. No meandering, no hesitation, just a single line from the dark trees to where she stood. Her pulse quickened. She had swept the yard the night before, certain the tracks would stop. They never did. Somewhere beyond the frosted pines, something was watching. She could feel it in the stillness, like eyes pressing against her back. The prints were fresh, too fresh. Her breath curled in pale clouds as she pushed the door wider, boots finding the porch with a muted thud. The boards beneath her feet creaked under the weight of frost. For a moment, she saw only the blank expanse of snow stretching toward the tree line, then her eyes fixed on them. They were back, a perfect trail of pawprints pressed deep and clean into the untouched snow. The prints started at the shadowed edge of the forest and ran in a direct, unbroken line toward her porch. They stopped just short of the first step, as if the maker had paused there waiting before turning back into the trees. There was no meandering, no hesitation, just a single purpose in each stride. Megan stepped down into the snow, boots sinking through the crust with a crunch. She crouched by the nearest print, tracing its outline with her gaze. The pads were oval, the toes splayed slightly, the size larger than she remembered from the first time she had seen them. Each depression was crisp, the edges still sharp from the freeze overnight. No snow had fallen since dawn. That meant the visitor had come after she had gone to bed and before the first light touched the forest. Her pulse quickened. She had swept the yard clear of all tracks the night before, certain that erasing the path might discourage whatever animal had been coming here. She had even scattered wood ash across the open ground, a trick she once read could break a scent trail. Yet the prints were here again, bolder than before, cutting across her efforts as if nothing she had done mattered. The forest at the edge of her property loomed silent, the bare branches swaying faintly under the weight of ice. Beyond the first row of pines, the shadows deepened quickly, the light fading to a cold blue darkness where her eyes could not penetrate. She scanned the undergrowth, half expecting movement, the shift of fur, a glint of eyes. Nothing stirred, only the soft hiss of the wind moving high in the canopy. She straightened slowly, her breath visible in the frigid air, and followed the prints back toward the porch. The silence pressed heavier now, a kind of listening quiet that made the hair at the back of her neck lift. She stepped up to the door but did not go inside. Instead, she turned back to face the trees again. That was when she saw it. A shape moved in the shadows, low to the ground, gliding between the trunks with a smoothness that was almost soundless. She could not see detail, only the faint suggestion of movement and the slight shift of darkness against darkness. Her eyes locked on the spot, straining to separate form from shadow. Then in a blink, it was gone, swallowed by the deeper forest as if it had never been there. Megan's heart thudded hard in her chest. She stood motionless, every muscle taut. The cold began to bite at her fingers, creeping through the gloves she had forgotten to put on. Still, she stared, scanning for any sign of return. The forest offered nothing in reply. Finally, she stepped back inside and closed the door, the latch clicking softly. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around her, but the tension in her chest did not ease. She crossed to the window that faced the clearing and pulled the curtain just far enough to see out. The prince sat there in the snow, a stark chain of evidence leading to her door, daring her to come and follow them back into the trees. She thought about the first morning she had noticed them. It had been nearly a week ago, after a light snowfall. At first she assumed they belonged to a stray dog from some distant property, but the isolation here was real. Her nearest neighbor lived far beyond the next ridge, and no one in their right mind would let an animal wander in these temperatures. The forest was thick, the weather harsh, and predators still roamed here. She had dismissed the prints as a one-time occurrence. Then they had appeared again and again, always in the night, always stopping at her porch. Her eyes returned to the place where the shape had moved moments ago. She imagined the unseen figure standing in that very spot hours earlier, watching the cabin through the dark, perhaps listening for movement inside. She told herself it was simply a curious animal, maybe a lost sled dog or a survivor from some distant homestead. Yet there was an intent to the tracks that unsettled her. They were not the wandering loops of a hungry creature searching for scraps. They were a path with a destination. The wind shifted, rattling a loose shingle above her head. She stayed by the window, unwilling to let the tracks out of her sight. Minutes stretched into a half-hour. No movement came from the trees. The forest remained still, its secrets sealed behind walls of ice and snow. By late morning, the light had grown brighter, casting long shadows across the clearing. Megan finally stepped back from the window and moved through the cabin, lighting the small wood stove and stoking it until the fire burned steady. The air inside warmed, but the image of those prints in the snow did not fade from her mind. They were fresh, too fresh. She told herself she would watch again tonight. She would keep the curtains open just enough to see the yard. If the visitor returned, she would be ready. Outside, the tracks waited, their frozen shapes marking the boundary between her world and the one watching from the forest. The light outside had already begun to dim by late afternoon, a soft gray settling over the snow like a blanket pulled tight across the land. Megan moved through the cabin with quiet purpose, checking each window, making sure the curtains could be drawn quickly. The stove gave a steady heat, the kind that seeped into the bones, but it did little to quiet the unease that had settled in her chest since morning. She could not help thinking back to the first morning she had found the prints. The snowfall then had been light, barely a dusting that turned the world into a pale sketch. She had stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, and seen the faint impressions leading to her door. They were shallow then, easily missed unless one looked closely. She had followed them a short way toward the trees, expecting them to curve off somewhere, to wander as any animal's path might. But they had stopped sharply at the forest's edge, the place where the pines grew tall and the undergrowth thickened. From there, the trail had vanished, as if the creature had been swallowed by the shadows. Every morning since, the pattern had repeated. Always from the trees to her porch, always straight, deliberate, unbroken. The snow had deepened in those days, and the prints had grown clearer, their edges sharper, their path more certain. It was as if the visitor had become bolder, less concerned about leaving a trail. That evening, Megan kept the main room dim, the only light a faint orange glow from the stove. She sat near the window with her camera resting on her lap, its lens already focused toward the clearing. The forest beyond the open ground stood dark and still, the trunks of the pines like black pillars against the snow. She knew that if anything moved there, the contrast would make it stand out. She waited as the last of the daylight faded, the pale sky giving way to a deepening blue. The air outside grew colder, the frost beginning to creep along the corners of the glass. A faint crack sounded from somewhere in the forest, like a branch breaking under weight. She lifted the camera, her heart beat loud in her ears. For a moment she thought she saw it, a shape just beyond the reach of the open snow, too far to make out clearly, but there, in the space between two trees, was something that was not shadow and not snow. It did not move at first. Then, as her eyes adjusted, it shifted ever so slightly, the way a body might when braced against the cold. Her finger rested on the camera's shutter. She lifted the viewfinder to her eye, the lens drawing the shape closer. The form was blurred by the faint haze of frost between her and it, and before she could adjust, it was gone, slipping backward into the darkness as if pulled away by unseen hands. She lowered the camera slowly. The forest now looked as it always did at nightfall, silent, unbroken, empty. Yet she knew it was not empty. It had not been for days. The hours stretched long. She stayed by the window, the dim room around her becoming nothing more than a shadowed frame for the view outside. The only sounds were the occasional pop from the stove and the faint groan of the cabin's timbers adjusting to the cold. Sometime past midnight, she caught the faintest movement again, not at the forest's edge, but closer, near the middle of the clearing. The shape was low, moving slowly, each step placed with care. She could not see detail, only the deliberate pace and the faint impression of legs pressing through the snow. It did not come all the way to the porch this time. Instead, it paused midway across the clearing, head lifted, as if scenting the air. Megan's breath stilled. She willed herself not to move, not even to raise the camera, afraid that any shift might break whatever held the creature in place. It stood there for what felt like a long time. Then, with a suddenness that made her flinch, it turned and loped back toward the trees, vanishing once more into the pines without a sound. By morning, the clearing was marked again, a fresh set of prints leading from the forest to the porch, their path overlapping with those from the day before. The snow was disturbed only in those two lines, the rest lying smooth and untouched. She studied them from the porch in the pale light. The pads were well defined, the toes splayed, the depth of the impressions showing the weight of the animal. She could not tell if it was heavier than before or if the snow had simply softened overnight. What unsettled her most was not the prints themselves, but the fact that each one faced directly toward her cabin. There were no signs of circling, no pauses to dig or scent mark. Just a path, as purposeful as any made by human boots. She stepped back inside and closed the door, the latch clicking in the quiet. She told herself she would try to follow them tomorrow. She would dress warm, take her camera, and see just how far they went before fading into the trees. But as the day wore on and the shadows began to lengthen once again, Megan knew that whatever waited in the forest was not going to be found easily. The morning broke with a brittle kind of cold, the kind that made the air sting in the lungs and turned every sound into a sharp, distinct note. Megan stood at the window before even lighting the stove, her eyes fixed on the clearing. The prints were there again, as she had expected, their dark shadows pressed into the white surface of the snow. This time she did not simply look from the safety of the cabin. She layered herself in thick wool and canvas, pulled on gloves and a knitted hat, and slung her camera across her chest. The cold bit instantly at her cheeks when she stepped outside. The boards of the porch groaned faintly under her boots, and the snow gave that crisp, hollow crunch that came only when the temperature had fallen far below freezing. The trail began, as always, at the forest's edge. The prints were deep and neatly formed, spaced with a rhythm that spoke of purposeful strides. She crouched beside one, brushing away the fine frost that had settled in the night. The pads were clearly defined, the toes splayed just slightly, and there was no sign of melting or collapse. These tracks had been made in the last few hours. She followed them, each step sinking into the snow beside the narrow path left by the animal. The clearing was silent save for the faint sound of wind high in the treetops. When she reached the line of pines, the stillness seemed to thicken, as though the forest were holding itself in a kind of quiet anticipation. The trail did not plunge deep into the trees immediately. Instead, it skirted the shadows, keeping close to the trunks where the snow was thinnest. She noticed that it avoided open spaces, weaving between the darker stands of timber. It was a pattern she recognized from tracking photographs, the movements of a creature that knew it was being watched, or that was careful by instinct. A few yards into the woods, she saw other signs. The snow here was disturbed in places, not by tracks, but by subtle marks where something had brushed past. One small cluster of flattened snow lay beside a pine trunk, and when she bent closer, she saw a few strands of fur caught on the rough bark. They were pale, almost silver, with a faint sheen in the light. She pinched one between her gloved fingers and studied it before tucking it carefully into her coat pocket. The trail wound deeper now, and the light grew dim under the canopy. The snow here held an untouched smoothness except where the pawprints pressed into it. She paused often, scanning the woods in slow arcs, her breath hanging in clouds before her face. A sudden movement caught her eye, not ahead, but high above. A crow launched itself from a branch, sending down a small flurry of snow. Its wings beat against the cold air, the sound loud in the silence, before it vanished into the deeper forest. She pushed onward, noting how the prints sometimes overlapped themselves, as if the animal had retraced its own steps. It was a trick often seen in predators, a way to confuse anything that might be following. The thought settled uneasily in her mind. Then she came upon a small hollow where the snow was disturbed in a different way, a shallow depression, as if the animal had sat there for some time. The surrounding snow was packed slightly, the shape of it matching the curve of a body at rest. From this spot, Megan realized the creature would have had a perfect view of the clearing and the cabin beyond. She felt the prickle at the back of her neck again, the sense of being studied in return. Her gaze swept the trees around her, but nothing moved. The forest seemed empty, yet she could not shake the weight of eyes on her. Pressing on, she noticed a faint change in the tracks. The strides were longer now, the impressions slightly deeper, as if the animal had picked up speed. They curved sharply to the left and began to descend toward a narrow gully. The air here felt even colder, the light dimmer still. At the bottom, a thin stream wound through the snow, its surface frozen into pale glass. The prince followed the edge for a short distance before crossing over, the ice holding firm under the weight. She stepped carefully after them, feeling the solid sheet under her boots. On the far side, she paused again. The forest was utterly still. No wind stirred here, no birds called. It was the kind of silence that made every sound she made seem too loud, too intrusive. She realized her breath had quickened without her noticing. Somewhere far off, faint but clear in the cold air, came a sound, one single bark. It echoed through the trees, carried on the wind in a way that seemed both close and distant at once. The tone was not sharp or aggressive, but steady and strong, the kind of call that carried purpose. Megan turned toward the sound, scanning the forest for movement, but the trees gave nothing away. The prints beneath her feet told the only clear story, and they were still leading forward, deeper into the pines. She stood there for a long moment, listening, but no second bark came. The silence closed in again, heavier now, and she felt the urge to return to the cabin rise in her chest. Yet the pull of the trail was stronger. She took another step forward, the snow giving beneath her boot, and followed the prints into the waiting shadows. By the time Megan returned to the cabin, the light had shifted into a dull, metallic gray that often came before heavy snow. She stamped the powder from her boots on the porch, casting one last glance toward the forest before stepping inside. The warmth of the wood stove wrapped around her, yet the cold seemed to cling beneath her skin, a chill that had little to do with the air. She set the camera on the table and pulled off her gloves, flexing fingers stiff from hours in the cold. As she moved about the small kitchen, her attention kept drifting to the window, where the sky hung low and heavy. The pines stood darker than usual, their upper branches swaying with the first hints of a gathering wind. The radio crackled faintly from the shelf above the counter, breaking the quiet with the low voice of the local weather broadcast. The words carried in steady, measured tones, a front moving in, rapid drop in temperature, heavy snowfall expected by nightfall. The kind of storm that would bury the road to the ridge and make travel impossible for days. Megan listened without much surprise. She had been in enough winters here to read the signs herself. Still, she felt the tightness in her chest grow. If the storm was as strong as they warned, she would be shut in, cut off from the outside. That would not have troubled her in other years, but this winter was different. This winter, something was coming to her door. Through the afternoon, she busied herself with the tasks that always came before a storm, hauling in extra wood for the stove, checking the seals on the windows, filling containers with water in case the pipes froze. Each time she stepped outside, the cold bit sharper, the wind catching at her coat and tugging at the ends of her hair. The forest loomed at the edge of the clearing, its shadows deepening as the light thinned. She had nearly finished stacking the last armful of wood when her eyes caught the clearing again. Her breath caught in her throat. The prints were there, not the faded remnants from the morning, but a new trail, sharp and clean, cutting straight across the snow toward her porch. She had not seen the animal approach, had not heard a sound. Yet here were the signs, as fresh as if they had been pressed only moments ago. The edges of each print still glittered with loose crystals, untouched by drift. Megan set the wood down slowly and moved toward the steps, her boots crunching against the frozen crust. She crouched beside the nearest mark, studying its depth and spacing. The paws were large, the stride steady, no drag marks, no hesitation. It was a direct path, and this time it ended only a few feet from where she stood. The forest beyond seemed to watch her in return. The air was still for a moment, the wind pausing as though holding its breath. Then, far above, a gust moved through the treetops, sending a soft hiss down into the clearing. Snow began to fall. At first, only a few lazy flakes drifted through the air, but within minutes the sky thickened, the flakes growing larger, heavier, swirling in the rising wind. The fresh prints blurred at the edges, then softened entirely as the storm began to lay its cover over the clearing. Megan stepped back to the porch and stood there watching until the trail was gone, erased by the steady fall. The strange mix of relief and unease tangled in her chest. The evidence had vanished, but so had the direction. She could no longer follow if she wanted to. The wind rose again, rattling the porch railing and whistling along the cabin walls. She retreated inside, bolting the door and pulling the heavy curtains across the windows. The light inside dimmed to a warm glow from the stove's fire, the outside world now nothing more than a muffled blur beyond the walls. Night fell quickly in the storm. The snow hissed against the glass and whispered along the roof, shifting in sudden gusts. Megan sat in the chair near the stove, her coat still draped over the back, listening for anything beyond the sound of wind. It came suddenly, a heavy, dull thud against the outer wall, low to the ground, as though something solid had pressed or struck just once before moving away. She froze, eyes lifting to the nearest window, though the curtains blocked any view. Her breath slowed to silence. The wind continued, the snow hissed on, but nothing else followed. She stayed there for a long time, every sense stretched thin, waiting for another sound. None came. When she finally moved, it was only to feed more wood to the fire. The heat flared, shadows leaping along the cabin walls. She kept the coat nearby, the boots close at hand. If the sound came again, she would be ready to look, ready to see what waited in the snow. The thud against the wall had left Megan restless, her thoughts circling through what might have made it. She told herself it could have been a heavy drift of snow slipping from the roof or a branch breaking under the weight of ice. Yet the sound had been too solid, too deliberate, as though something had pressed there with purpose before moving on. The storm continued deep into the night. Snow lashed against the windows in quick bursts, then softened to a steady whisper, only to rise again with the next gust. The fire burned low in the stove, casting a red glow across the small room. Megan sat in the chair with her coat pulled around her, the flashlight resting on the table beside her hand. For a long while she listened to the rhythm of the wind, waiting for any change in its tone. The minutes passed with only the shifting patterns of the storm outside. Then she caught it, a faint sound beneath the wind's rush, subtle but distinct. A muffled crunch. Another. She rose slowly, slipping the strap of the flashlight over her wrist. The boots went on next, the laces pulled tight. She hesitated at the door, hand on the latch, feeling the cold seeping through the wood. Then she pulled it open. The wind struck her full in the face, sharp and stinging with snow. Her breath formed thick clouds as she stepped out onto the porch. The beam of the flashlight cut through the swirling flakes, its circle of light shifting in the wind. The clearing lay in a restless dance of white, the falling snow flattening the shapes of the land. She moved down the steps, the snow already deep enough to catch at her calves. The beam swept across the clearing, revealing only a shifting curtain of white. Then, at the far edge, where the forest loomed, the light caught on something pale. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, a flash of fur vanishing behind the trunk of a pine. Megan's heart thudded hard, the sound loud in her ears beneath the hiss of snow. She moved forward, the wind tugging at her coat, the cold seeping through the layers. The prints were there, though softened by the snowfall. She followed them across the clearing, the beam tracking their path until they disappeared into the shadows of the trees. She hesitated at the forest's edge. The pines swayed faintly above, their dark forms leaning and creaking in the wind. The snow here fell slower, drifting down through the branches in heavy clumps. She stepped inside the tree line, the beam darting from trunk to trunk. The darkness here felt thicker, more enclosed, the wind muted by the shelter of the trees. The prints wound between the trunks, curving out of sight. A faint sound reached her, not the wind, not the creak of ice. It was the soft crunch of snow, measured and steady, as if something moved in a slow arc around her position. The beam swung toward the sound, catching only empty air and the occasional swirl of falling snow. Her breath came faster now, each inhale sharp in the cold. She turned slowly, scanning the shadows. There was no rush of movement, no obvious form, yet the sense of being circled grew stronger with each passing moment. Then it happened, something brushed against her leg. Not hard, not enough to knock her off balance, but a clear contact. Her body jolted with the shock of it. She swung the beam down and around, catching only the churned snow where she stood. The prints were deeper here now, pressed freshly into the surface. The sound of movement came again, this time from behind her. She spun, the flashlight beam catching on a low shape slipping between two trees. It moved with a smooth, deliberate pace, head low, body lean. For a heartbeat, the light reflected off its eyes, two pale, steady points that locked on her before the shape turned and vanished deeper into the forest. Megan's pulse pounded in her ears. She took a step forward, the urge to follow warring with the instinct to retreat. The snow swirled in the beam of light, erasing the sharpness of distance, making the shadows merge into one another. Another gust moved through the pines, showering her in loose snow from above. When it passed, the forest seemed empty again. The prints at her feet led into the darkness, but the path beyond had already begun to soften under the falling flakes. She stood there for a long moment, the cold seeping deeper into her limbs, the air biting at her face. The pale eyes lingered in her mind, calm, watchful, and unafraid. Then she turned and retraced her steps, following the beam back through the trees and across the clearing toward the cabin. Inside, the heat of the stove felt almost unreal after the sharp cold outside. She peeled off her coat and boots, her hands tingling as the warmth returned. She moved to the window and looked out through a narrow gap in the curtain. The clearing was already smoothing over, the prints fading into the white. The eyes stayed with her, hovering in the darkness of her thoughts, a quiet reminder that the watcher had been closer tonight than ever before. The storm did not end so much as it settled, like a heavy blanket laid over a restless body. By the time the last light drained from the sky, the wind had quieted to steady breath across the roof, and the snow had thinned to a fine sift that glowed when it crossed the stove's faint halo on the window glass. Megan moved through the cabin with deliberate care, as if any sudden sound might draw something closer from the trees. The thud from earlier still lived in her muscles, a memory that tightened her shoulders whenever the building creaked. She added split logs to the fire and watched them catch. The flames stepped up the bark in small orange ladders, then settled into a slow burn. The warmth should have been comforting. It was not. The heat felt separate from the rest of the night, like a small island in a dark sea. Beyond the walls lay cold, distance, and a presence that had become a routine she did not choose. She checked each window again. The curtains were mostly drawn, but she left narrow gaps at the bottoms, slim slices of the outside that would show movement if anything crossed the clearing. Frost feathered the edges of the glass. Every so often a soft pat sounded from above, as snow slipped off the higher roof and landed on the lower slope. She forced herself to catalog each noise and assign it a harmless cause. Then a new sound would arrive and the catalog would feel false again. She tried to eat. The taste of the soup was thin and metallic, as if the ladle had altered the water. The heat was the only thing she could register. When the bowl was empty, she could not have said what had been in it. She set the spoon down and listened. At first, there was only the wind. Then, tucked lightly under it, came a soft scrape across wood. It was not loud. It was not long. It could have been a loose branch dragged by a gust, except there was no gust. The air outside had stilled. Megan held her breath and counted to a slow number in her head. The scrape came again, closer this time, lower, as if something brushed the base of the wall near the porch. She moved to the door with care, eased the chain aside, and pressed her ear to the wood. The cold bled through and chilled her skin. Beneath the sleep of the timbers, she could hear the outside world as a low hum, then a delicate crunch, then nothing. She waited. A single step sounded against the packed snow of the porch, not the long slide of drift, not the soft fall of powder. A step, the kind made by weight and choice. Her hand found the flashlight on the table and closed over it. She did not open the door. She stood with the beam pointed down at the crack along the floor, ready to lift. The step came again, closer. She pictured a body pressed near, fur thick with ice crystals, breath fogging the night air. The image formed on its own and would not leave. She waited for a third step. It did not come. The quiet returned and settled, full and heavy. A small sound touched the window near the stove. It was the faintest tap, like a fingernail against glass. She turned without moving her feet, as if any shift might signal that she was listening. Another tap, then stillness. The hours stretched. Sleep did not come. When she tried to close her eyes on the chair by the stove, her body jerked awake at each new creak. The cabin felt like a living thing that knew she was watching. She stood and paced the small length between the door and the sink. At some point she pulled on her coat and hat and boots and sat with them on, as if the extra layers might steady her. She kept the flashlight where her right hand could find it in an instant. Sometime deep in the night, the wind picked up again and pushed restless fingers under the eaves. The stove sighed. The clock on the shelf ticked with the faint effort of a tired heart. Megan closed her eyes and listened with her skin. A shiver moved through the walls that was not wind. She felt it more than heard it. The hair along her arms lifted despite the layers. Then came a new sound. It began at the far corner of the porch with a soft crunch, then crossed to the other side in a slow, measured line. Footfalls. She counted them without meaning to, a handful only, then silence. The steps did not descend the stairs. Whoever had made them remained on the boards above the snow. She pictured a shape near the door. She pictured a head tilting. She pictured breath striking cold wood and freezing there in a thin coat of rime. She did not open the door. Time went loose. The night became a loop of waiting, listening, and crossing the room to stare at darkness through a narrow gap. Once, when she leaned near the kitchen window, her own reflection startled her, a pale oval above the scarf she had pulled high across her face. Beyond her reflected outline, the clearing looked like a blank sheet that had been erased too many times. No prints were visible. The new fall had filled every depression. The surface was flawless, as if a careful hand had smoothed it for a fresh attempt. Near the deepest hour, when even the stove seemed to breathe more slowly, a sound from the back of the cabin broke across the quiet. It was a soft skitter followed by a deeper weight. The back steps were narrower and older than the front ones. They answered each press with a dull note. First one, then another, then a pause. Megan's mouth went dry. She tried to shape a reason for the sound that did not have eyes and intention. The reasons would not form. She stood with her hand on the back door's frame and waited. The next sound was longer, as if something leaned against the wood itself. She imagined the pressure. The door did not move. The presence receded. A minute later she heard it again at the side of the cabin, near the stack of firewood, then again near the corner where the roofline met the porch. It felt like a slow circle, not searching, confirming. She did not sleep. Dawn arrived not as a color but as a slow lifting of the dark. The snow eased into a faint blue and the lines of the trees took shape beyond the clearing. For a long time she did not move. She waited for the sounds to declare themselves in daylight terms. The silence now had a new weight, like a held breath waiting for permission. At last she unlatched the door and eased it open. Cold struck her face like a clean blade. She stepped onto the porch, her boots landing on boards that were ridged with thin drifts. The rail was capped with a smooth bar of snow that had not yet broken from its own weight. She looked down. The prints were there. They were so close that for a heartbeat she could not make sense of their shape. The nearest set sat at the foot of the top step. Another set lay beside the door frame, pressed into the drift that had piled along the threshold. The edges were perfect. The centers were granulated with the delicate crystals that form when the air is colder than it needs to be. The pattern matched the trail she had followed in the forest. The stride was the same. The splay of the toes was the same. The size had not changed. The closeness had. A smear marked the base of the door at ankle height. It was a dark, wet brush against the wood that had frozen into a dull shine. A paw must have lifted there and slid a little before settling again. The mark was not a scratch. It was not a claw test. It was a touch. Megan knelt and brought her face close. The scent was faint and clean and edged with wild. Snow stung her cheeks while she studied the mark. When she stood, her knees felt hollow. She traced the new trail with her eyes. It came from the line of pines as always, moved with confidence across the open ground, climbed the steps, paused at the door, circled once around the porch, and returned to the steps. At the bottom it veered to the side where the drifts were deeper, skirted the corner of the cabin, and vanished along the back path where the snow lay smoother under the lower roof. From there it cut across the clearing again and slipped into the trees at a different point than before. It had made a slow ring around the cabin during the darkest part of night. Megan followed, careful not to disturb the clearest impressions. The light strengthened as she moved along the porch. From the top step she scanned the edge of the forest. Nothing moved. The pines stood watch with their grave, dark patience. The air was so cold that sound seemed to travel further than it should. Far above, a raven called once and then fell silent. She descended the steps and stepped into the yard. The snow took her weight to mid-calf. At each lift of her foot, the surface broke with a brittle sigh. She walked to the edge of the porch where the smear had been made and crouched again to see the angle of the paw. The toes faced the door. The weight had been forward. The line of the leg had likely brushed the wood. She would have to photograph it soon before the light shifted and softened the details. When she rose, a sound slid into the morning from the deeper forest. It was thin at first, then fuller as it rode the cold air, a howl, not a chorus, a single voice. The tone traveled cleanly over the snow and hit the open ground with a shiver that she felt in her ribs. It was not a frantic cry. It was not a warning. It was a call with a steady center. Another voice answered it from a distance that was hard to judge. The second tone was lower and it broke near the end, like an older singer who knew the notes but could not hold them as long anymore. The two sounds met above the clearing and braided for a brief measure. Then they ceased. Silence returned with a deeper gravity. Megan stood very still. The prints at her feet seemed to darken, as if the sound had pressed them deeper into the snow. She turned toward the pines and felt the old awareness rise again along her spine. The watcher had not come alone last night, or if it had allies within calling distance. She moved along the visible trail that circled the cabin and noted how the steps changed near the back corner. There the impressions lay closer together, as if the body had lowered. The boards of the narrow steps held shallow crescents where weight had shifted from pad to pad. A few fine hairs lay caught on a splinter. She lifted one with the edge of a glove. It glinted pale in the weak sun. She tucked it away in her coat pocket beside the earlier find from the pine bark. At the far side of the porch, where the rail met the wall, the snow showed a delicate pattern she had not seen before. The marks were smaller and did not press as deep. She crouched to look. Perhaps the watcher had paused long enough for frost to build on its coat and then had shaken it free. A fine spray lay across the rail like a dusting of sugar that the morning had not yet claimed. She was careful not to touch it. Back inside the cabin, she removed her boots and stood on the rug, feeling the warmth of the stove find her feet through thick socks. The night had left behind a tangible map. The fear had left behind its own. She felt both at once. She set water on to heat and positioned her camera by the door. Then she opened the curtain gaps a little wider. If the watcher returned in daylight, she would see. If it waited until dusk, she would be ready. The hours after dawn moved with a thin, tight rhythm. She wrote a few notes in a pad on the table with clumsy gloves still on her hands. The handwriting slanted with more force than needed. She listed the sounds in order and marked the places where weight had pressed wood. She drew a rough shape of the yard and circled the points where the prints had paused. The act steadied her. It turned the night into a set of facts that could be reviewed. It did not change what the facts implied. When the sun had lifted a hand's width, the howl came again. This time it was further off, and the answer did not follow. The note lingered over the ridge and then faded like a ribbon pulled through a ring. The clearing seemed to exhale. The cold remained, but the air felt less tense. Megan stepped to the door and looked at the smear one more time. The mark had begun to dull as frost climbed over it. Soon it would be only a shadow in the grain of the wood. She touched the frame with the back of her fingers, not to feel the cold, but to mark the place in her body so she would remember the exact height and position. The watcher had lifted a paw here. It had touched her door. It had asked something without sound. She closed her eyes and let the quiet fill her ears. When she opened them, she turned to gather her pack. The next time the prints appeared, she would follow at once. She would not wait for noon or for a clearer sky. She would move as the trail still whispered under the surface. The watcher had come close enough to mark the door. The forest had answered with its voices. She felt that the line between her world and theirs had thinned to a thread. Out across the snow, a faint drift lifted and danced and settled again. The pines held their posts. The day stretched ahead like a page yet to be written. Somewhere in the blue shadows under those trees, ears turned toward her cabin, and a steady gaze measured the distance between the two lives that were learning how to share a winter. The air that morning held the brittle clarity that comes after a deep freeze, when sound carries far and each breath hangs in the light like a wisp of spun glass. Megan stood at the window with her gloves already on and her coat zipped to the chin. She had been awake before the first blush of dawn, waiting for movement. The prints had come again, though this time she had seen them appear. It began as a shape at the far edge of the clearing, low and lean, slipping between the pines with the fluid pace of something that belonged to the snow. The figure broke from the shadows and crossed the open ground without pause, each stride sure and even. She had been ready. By the time it reached the porch, she had the door open and her boots already on the steps. The animal froze when it saw her, not in fear, but in a kind of measured calculation. Its coat was a pale blend of gray and white that caught the early light in a faint shimmer. The eyes were bright, steady, and the shape of them struck her as both wild and knowing. She recognized the breed in that moment, a husky, though its frame carried a leaner edge than the well-fed companions she had seen in photographs. This one was cut by the cold and the miles. For the space of a breath, they regarded one another. Then the husky turned sharply and bounded back across the snow toward the forest. The prints left behind were crisp, the edges throwing small shadows in the low light. Megan did not hesitate. She shouldered her pack, slung the camera across her chest, and stepped into the trail while the marks were still fresh enough to hold the memory of weight. The chase led her across the clearing at a pace just shy of a run, her boots biting into the crust. The husky moved with deceptive ease, covering ground with fewer strides than she expected. It reached the tree line and slipped between the first two pines without breaking stride. She followed, the dimmer light under the canopy closing around her like water over a swimmer's head. Here the snow was shallower, broken in places by roots and fallen limbs. The tracks wound between the trunks, weaving a path that avoided the densest undergrowth. She could see the movement ahead in quick flashes, the pale flank sliding past a tree, the flick of a tail disappearing behind a drift. It never vanished entirely. It stayed just within her sight, close enough to follow, far enough to remain untouchable. The forest floor began to slope, and the trail angled upward toward a low ridge. The climb was steady, the air growing thinner and sharper with each step. She felt the burn in her legs, the tight pull in her chest, but the sight of the husky cresting the ridge pulled her onward. When she reached the top, the view opened briefly to a sweep of snow-covered hills and bare-limbed trees stretching into the distance. The husky stood near the crest, its head turned toward her. The light caught the eyes again, that same steady, unblinking regard. The animal's breath showed in short bursts, but its body held no sign of strain. They stood like that for a long moment, the only sound the faint whisper of wind through the branches. Then the husky turned and began moving down the far side of the ridge. This descent was steeper, the snow looser, and she had to place her steps carefully to avoid sliding. The tracks here pressed deeper into the slope, sometimes scattering powder ahead of them. Halfway down, she noticed something new. Another set of prints cut across the husky's trail at an angle. These were larger, the pads broader, the stride longer. The snow at the edges of these impressions was slightly collapsed, as though the weight behind them had been heavier. The pattern suggested a creature moving with purpose, not wandering. The husky's path veered slightly after this crossing, curving toward a stand of young pines. Megan followed, glancing often at the second trail. The larger prints did not follow the husky directly, but their proximity gnawed at her thoughts. She imagined the animal ahead aware of them as well, adjusting its route for reasons she could not yet see. The slope leveled out at the bottom into a narrow corridor of trees where the snow was smoother and the light dim. The husky paused here, looking back once more before slipping into the shadows ahead. Megan pressed forward, the cold air sharp in her lungs, her boots leaving a second trail alongside the first. Every step carried her further from the safety of the cabin and deeper into the forest's quiet heart. The prints of the husky remained clear, guiding her onward. The larger tracks, too, reappeared now and then, cutting across at odd intervals, as though circling or paralleling her own path. The air here felt different, heavier, as though holding the memory of movement. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked under weight. She froze, scanning the trees, but nothing moved in the dim light. When she turned back to the trail, the husky was gone from sight, only the fresh prints leading into the deepening shadows ahead. The corridor of trees narrowed until the branches overhead knit together in a loose canopy, muting what little light filtered through the winter sky. Megan moved more slowly now, the air here colder, the snow deeper in places where the wind had dropped its weight. The husky's tracks were as fresh as her own, each print holding the clean edges of recent pressure. The larger prints still appeared now and again, crossing or paralleling the husky's path. She studied them when they emerged, noticing that their strides sometimes shortened, as if the animal, whatever it was, had slowed to watch. The knowledge sat at the base of her spine like a small, hard knot. The forest opened slightly ahead, revealing a shallow basin ringed by saplings bent under the weight of snow. The husky's tracks led straight into it. Megan followed, her breath loud in her own ears. The air felt stiller here, as though sound had been pressed down into the snow and could not rise. Halfway across the basin, she saw the first sign that something was wrong. The snow to her right was churned up in a rough patch, the smooth surface broken into jagged mounds. Small flecks of dark marred the whiteness, frozen droplets that had sunk slightly into the crust before hardening. She crouched, brushing away a layer of powder to see them more clearly. Blood. Not much, but enough to mark that something had been wounded here. She traced the churn outward with her eyes and saw where the husky's tracks overlapped with the larger ones. The prints tangled for a short stretch, then split apart sharply, the husky's path veering left while the heavier trail turned to the right. The churned snow drew her onward until she reached the edge of a small thicket. The young pines here were clustered tightly together, their lower branches sweeping the snow like brooms. From within came the faintest sound, not the rustle of wind, but something more irregular, more fragile. A shift, a low breath, the subtle creak of weight shifting against frozen ground. The husky appeared then, emerging from behind one of the outer trees. Its coat was dusted with frost, the fur along its shoulders lifting slightly in the cold. It met her gaze for a heartbeat, then turned toward the thicket and gave a single sharp bark. The sound was not loud, but it cut through the basin's stillness with purpose. Megan hesitated, her boots anchored in the snow. The husky barked again, shorter this time, then stepped aside to clear a path toward the thicket. She moved forward, pushing through the first sweep of low branches. Inside, the air was even colder, the snow thinner where the canopy held it back. In the narrow space at the center lay a shape half buried by drift. For a moment she could not make sense of it. Then the pale curve of a face emerged from the snow, the skin drawn and colorless, a scattering of frost along the hairline. A person, the figure lay curled on one side, an arm drawn toward the chest, the other outstretched toward the base of a tree. The clothing was layered but not thick enough for this cold. Snow had worked its way into the folds, crusting the seams in white. The breath was faint, visible only when she leaned close enough to feel its whisper against the air. Megan dropped to her knees beside the stranger, brushing snow from the shoulders and collar. The skin was cold, but not yet without life. She pressed a hand gently against the side of the neck until she felt a pulse, slow, weak, but present. The husky stood close, its body angled slightly toward the forest beyond, ears turning toward distant sounds she could not hear. It stepped forward and lowered its head, touching the stranger's shoulder with its nose before looking back at Megan. The message was clear. This was why it had come. She looked toward the trees in the direction of the larger prints. The shadows there felt heavier, and the silence had a weight that was different from the stillness of snow. Whatever had left those marks was still near. The husky seemed to know it too. Its posture was tense, its gaze sweeping the tree line before returning to her. The stranger's breath hitched once, shallow and thin. Megan knew the cold was working fast now, faster than she could spare. She pulled her pack forward, unfastening the blanket she kept rolled against the side. The fabric was stiff with frost from the air, but she wrapped it tightly around the curled form, tucking it beneath the body to trap what little heat remained. The husky stepped closer still, so near she could feel the faint warmth through its coat. It glanced toward the forest again, then back to her, its eyes sharp and steady. The wind shifted, bringing with it a faint sound from deeper among the pines, a crunch, slow and deliberate. The larger prince had a voice after all. Megan tightened the blanket and hooked her arms under the stranger's shoulders. The body was lighter than she expected, but awkward in its looseness. The husky circled once around them, then positioned itself toward the tree line, as if to keep whatever followed at a distance. Snow began to fall again, thin at first, then thicker, swirling down into the basin. The flakes caught on the husky's fur and melted into darkened patches before freezing again. She adjusted her grip and began to drag the stranger from the thicket, each step heavy in the deep snow. The husky moved alongside, its pace matched to hers, eyes still scanning the dark edges of the trees. They had only reached the basin's midpoint when the sound came again from behind, heavier now, closing the distance. The sound from the tree line came again, closer, its weight breaking through the frozen crust with each step. Megan's muscles tightened, the cold now secondary to the urgency in her chest. She kept her grip on the stranger, shifting her weight to drag them faster across the basin. The husky moved at her side, its pace steady, ears turned toward the approach. The snow thickened, the flakes growing large and wet, clinging to her coat and eyelashes. The weight of the storm blurred the edges of the world until the trees, sky, and ground folded into a single shifting white. Behind her, the approaching steps halted. A pause stretched long enough for her to feel the hair at the back of her neck lift. Then the sound began again, veering slightly, as if circling to follow from a different angle. The husky slowed briefly, turned toward the noise, and gave a low, rolling growl. The tone was not loud, but it was deep enough to carry through the storm. Whatever moved in the shadows kept its distance after that, the steps fading into the layered hiss of falling snow. Megan focused on the slope ahead, where the ridge curved back toward the route she had taken earlier. Each step upward was a drag, her boots sinking deep, the stranger's body heavy and awkward in her arms. The husky surged ahead for a few strides, then stopped to glance back, tail low but moving in short arcs, urging her onward. The climb felt longer than it had that morning. The wind here struck sideways, pushing snow into her hood and down her collar. Her breath came fast and shallow, each inhale burning her throat. When she reached the top, the clearing beyond was almost invisible in the storm's churn. The husky took the lead without hesitation, finding the half-buried trail back toward the cabin. Megan followed, trusting the animal's sense of direction when her own landmarks had been erased by white. The stranger's head shifted once against her shoulder, a faint movement that told her life still lingered inside the cold shell she carried. The snow was deeper now, and every step was a negotiation with the weight of it. She thought of stopping to rest, but knew that the cold would claim that moment as its own. The husky moved ahead, sometimes glancing back to check her position, sometimes vanishing briefly into the storm before reappearing along the trail. When at last the outline of the cabin formed in the white, relief came so sharply it almost weakened her knees. She reached the porch and dragged the stranger up the steps, pushing the door open with her shoulder. Warm air rolled out from the stove, thin compared to the cold, but rich enough to feel like safety. Inside, she laid the stranger near the fire, working quickly to strip away the outer layers of frozen clothing. Beneath, the skin was pale and the muscles slack, but the faint rise and fall of the chest remained. She wrapped them in the thickest blankets she had, tucking hot stones from the stove inside the folds to drive warmth back into the core. The husky came in after her, shaking snow from its coat in a slow ripple. It stood near the blankets for a moment, lowering its head to sniff the stranger's face before stepping back. The animal's sides rose and fell in even breaths, its eyes never straying far from the figure by the fire. Time became a series of small, careful actions, feeding the stove, checking the stranger's pulse, changing the warmed stones for fresh ones. The storm outside pressed at the walls, but the inside world was defined by the steady crackle of wood and the rhythmic sound of two different patterns of breathing. It was hours before the stranger's eyelids flickered open. The eyes beneath were unfocused at first, then sharpened slightly as they took in the cabin, the fire, the bundled layers around them. The lips moved, but no sound came. Megan poured a small amount of warm water and lifted it to their mouth, steadying the cup until they swallowed. The gaze shifted then, landing on the husky. Something passed in that look, recognition, relief, a quiet understanding that made the air between them feel briefly warmer. The stranger lifted one hand, slow and weak, and the husky stepped forward to press its muzzle against the palm. No words were spoken, but the story was there in the gesture. The husky had not been wandering without reason. It had been guarding, searching, and waiting for the chance to bring help. The prints at Megan's door had been less about curiosity and more about trust, a silent call to follow. As the stranger's breathing steadied and the fire held its heat, Megan sat back in the chair by the stove. The husky lay near the blankets, head resting on its paws, eyes half closed but still watching. The storm outside began to soften, the wind's voice fading to a quieter note. When dawn came again, the world was wrapped in deep, unbroken snow. Megan opened the door to a clearing that held no fresh tracks, only the smooth surface of a winter reset. The husky stood beside her for a long moment, then stepped forward into the whiteness, pausing once to look back. She held its gaze until it turned toward the forest, moving with that same sure, silent pace that had carried it through the storm. The trees took it in without a sound, leaving only the memory of the watch it had kept and the life it had saved.
Dogs truly are the most loyal companions in our lives. What did you think of this heartwarming story? Let us know in the comments. Like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for daily emotional dog stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Click here to watch the next story of love, loyalty, and the incredible bond we share with our pawsome friends.